From Troy Public Radio, Troy University, and the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama, this is It Came from the Archives. I'm Greg Phillips. Each episode, we delve into the archives to bring you a topic, introduce you to someone new, or tell you a story about the Wiregrass region and the surrounding area. Our guide is Marty Olaf, director of the Wiregrass Archives at Troy University. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of It Came from the Archives. We are going to talk about some not even American soldiers. We're going to talk about some Royal Air Force pilots from Great Britain who did some training right down the road at Napier Field right here in Dothan. So, Marty, what can you tell us? We're in the height of World War II. We're going back to the early 1940s, and set the stage for us about today's topic.
Sure. World War II began in earnest on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. And if you don't know, the Soviet Union invaded Poland at the same time from the other direction. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but Poland ceased to exist after about a month. But the next thing, after the 1939 invasion, Hitler turned his eyes toward France, defeated France by June of 1940, turned his eyes toward England, and began what's commonly referred to as the Battle of Britain, which was, generally speaking, an air battle. There was always a threat of invasion, and, at the time, nobody, and probably even the German High Command, weren't sure how the Battle of Britain was going to play out, whether it was going to remain an aerial battle or whether it was going to be an invasion or a naval battle. There were just too many variables, and no one was really sure what would happen. So even in 1941, remember, Americans did not enter the war until December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, and did not declare war on Germany until a couple of days later, after Germany declared war on the U.S. But in April of 1941, General Hap Arnold of the Army Air Corps, the U.S. Army Air Corps, devised a thing called the Arnold Scheme.
Does this relate to my favorite action star of the 1980s by any chance?
No.
Oh,
sorry.
Dang.
Anyway, this Arnold Scheme called for training RAF pilots, Royal Air Force pilots, in primary flying, basic flying, and advanced flight training in the United States, and actually at the Army Air Corps' Southeast Air Corps Training Center, which was headquartered at Maxwell Field. Now, they did not train necessarily at Maxwell Field, but the people that needed primary training, this is an airplane, don't wreck it. They trained at a couple of different fields. Then they advanced to basic flight training at other fields, all in the Southeast, all in Alabama and a couple in Georgia. And then there were two advanced training bases. This is where you learned how to fight in an aircraft. For single-engine pursuit planes, there was another one for bombers. One of these training bases for single-engine pursuit planes was at Craig Field in Selma, and the other was at Napier Field near Dothan that was built specifically for the Arnold plan. And it became an incorporated town in the 1970s after the Army abandoned it almost immediately after the Second World War. These cadet pilots arrived at Napier Field, in fact, before it was completed. In 1940, they started arriving in early 1942, and their classes were designated by year and consecutive letter. The first class was called SE-42A, single engine, 1942, first class, A. And the last one was SE-43C, which was not a complete class. It was people that had somehow or another not graduated with their classes, plus some advanced people from other airfields that were just mopping up the program, basically. The classes consisted of about 200 cadets each. These are the Napier Field classes, about 200 cadets each, and they alternated so that they overlapped at about the midpoint in their 8-week training cycle. So Class SE-42B arrived at the 4-week mark in Class A's training. Class C replaced Class A and arrived at about the 4-week mark into Class B's training. So except for that very first 4 weeks, classes had 200 people each, but there were 2 classes going on simultaneously. So 400 cadets. And that does not include all of the support personnel and security personnel that are required. So all of a sudden, this cotton and peanut field that was Napier Field became home to 3,000-4,000 people very quickly, very rapidly.
I don't know if we have any documentation to bear this out or not. I have to imagine there was something of a culture clash coming from Great Britain into rural Alabama in the early part of the 20th century.
Well, I imagine it wasn't just this business of English folk coming over to rural South Alabama, but it was also, first of all, people in wartime England coming to relatively peaceful Alabama. They weren't being attacked. And if the Arnold Scheme got started because you couldn't train pilots in Great Britain during the Battle of Britain. There were just too many German airplanes to take pot shots at people who couldn't fly. And if you look back at some of the statistics in World War I, where American pilots basically trained in France near the combat zone, for a long time, the lifespan of an American pilot in France was 3 weeks. So the Brits didn't want that to happen because they just lose too many people. It's just not right. So they trained in India, in the colonies. They trained in South Africa, and they also trained in the United States under this Arnold Scheme. But they were also in a relatively isolated situation. They were on base. They didn't work 24/7, but it was military training, and they could get off base, but they didn't spend a lot of time off base. We do have a little bit of documentation of how they related. I haven't looked at the newspapers, but we have some documentation about how they related to local residents in Dothan. In the John Davis papers, Record Group 7, there are 27 letters that are not yet online from 2 pilots who got connected with the Davis family in Dothan and wrote them for about 3 years after they finished their pilot training. And then they went back to fight. One of them ended up in Burma, and the other, I believe, was in Britain. And I'm not sure if he flew combat missions or was in an administrative position. But they wrote back, and they seemed to really enjoy it. They talked about how nice everybody had been to them, especially when they were in places where they were kind of lonely or, people shooting at you kind of make you upset. So especially the guy in Burma was pining for the conditions that he had here in Dothan, and I suspect that really what we're looking at are people who open their arms in both directions in order to be worthy of being welcomed and welcome these allies. Because certainly after December 7th, 1941, we were allies with the British if we weren't before. Everybody knew why they were here in Napier Field. They knew, the populace knew, and everybody just tried to get along.
One of the things in your article, it mentions Kelly Springs Pavilion, which I don't even know, is that still a thing? Does that exist to this day? I didn't recognize it from the photo. And it mentions that there are indications that some of these cadets snuck off base to visit people in Dothan. What do we know about that?
These 2 guys in these 27 letters from the John Davis papers talk about having snuck off base to go over to Kelly Springs. Kelly Springs is now, the actual springs is on the property owned by Troy University Dothan campus. It's right out in the back of the campus proper, just off to the side of our big walking trail in the back. And between some of the land that we gave to the city of Portland supports Kelly Springs Elementary School. That's the site of Kelly Springs Elementary. So we're right there at Kelly Springs. It's right here. In May 30th, 1942, a big pavilion opened at Kelly Springs for recreational swimming. And Kelly Springs was a cold springs, so they built decking and they built, like I said, a pavilion. They laid some concrete, and people would drive over and they would recreate. The local kids, men and women, the guys from Napier Field would come over, and sometimes they would come over when they weren't supposed to come over, when they were supposed to be on base. And these two guys in particular talked about sneaking off to come see a movie in town. I'm sure they hitch a ride or drive into town and probably grab a couple of girlfriends and go off to the movie.
Well, hey, I'm glad that the Wiregrass was able to offer them a little bit of something to maybe take their mind off of the fact they're training to go try to take these Nazis out of the sky.
Yep. And unfortunately to be taken out of the sky too. Yeah.
It mentions, you also talk about the washout rates, so to speak, under the Arnold scheme, but that this program in particular, these RAF pilots, mostly didn't wash out. Talk a little bit about that.
When you're doing primary flight school, they're looking hard at you to see if you're going to be capable of doing more, if you've just bitten off more than you can chew. And so washout rates in the primary flight schools pretty high. Washout rates in the basic schools about 50%. But then by the time you get to advanced flight training, you're both highly motivated and you've been selected for your capacity as well as for your morale. And so washout rates were not that high in the advanced fighter school. And the RAF, now the U.S. Army did Air Corps things a little differently, but specifically the RAF commissioned as lieutenants about 1/3 of their pilot cadets after graduation, and then about 2/3 of their pilot cadets were turned into what they called sergeant pilots, kind of a technical sergeant in the equivalent in the U.S. Army at that time. Some of these pilots, the really good ones, were often kept as instructors, either here or they'd be sent off to different flying schools, some in the U.S. and some in other places, including back into England, where if you were a pilot in England, you still had to get your hours in, even if you were potentially fending off Germans at the time, which of course didn't happen after about 1942. And then others had operational assignments. You know, not everybody flies, not everybody's at the front, but you still have to know what's going on in order to run the various administrative capacities that most militaries have to heavily staff. You know, most military people end up in administrative capacity in one way or another, not on the front line. But you know, while they were at Napier Field, we have this one cadet named DSS Fraser, and that's where I got interested in this. He died in England in about 2010, and one of his friends, and this is always an apocryphal archive story, one of his friends rescued a body of Napier Field material from the trash right after this guy died. And so he discovered who the Wiregrass Archives was, and then he mailed them to us. He didn't contact us, he just mailed them to us and said, "Do you want these things?" And we were all over them. We didn't have any kind of this material. This came in before the John Davis material came in. So we found out that this cadet, DSS Fraser, was in class SE 42H, and he arrived with 184 of his closest friends in the RAF and a few Americans on July 5th, 1942, and he graduated on September 6th, 1942. While he was there, he and his class trained on the A6 trainer. They had trained, and we have a photograph of him with a Stearman trainer. That was probably at his basic. These guys made cross-country flights. A few of them crashed, not necessarily in this class. They learned how to fly in formation, very important. They went down to Eglin Field in Florida and practiced aerial gunnery, flying around shooting at targets. When they were here, they shot thousands of rounds of skeet. I didn't know this. And it was a little bit of a surprise when I found it out, and then I thought about it, and it's like, well, this makes perfect sense. While these guys are not flying in their airplane practicing their gunnery, they're learning how to lead a target with shot. So they shot skeet because that's what you do. Like bird hunting, really, when you're flying combat missions, if you're not doing close ground support, you're bird hunting. The principles are kind of the same. Fraser, as well as everybody else, and we know this happened to Fraser because we have specific documents for it, which are kind of silly looking because they're handmade and they're very cartoony. He became proficient in instrument-only flying, and this cracked me up in on-ground thing called the link trainer, which the cadets referred to as the Jeep. And if you see them, and I saw one of these at the International Women's Aerospace and Flight Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, and I didn't know what I was looking at. They look like those old kids' rides that you would plug a quarter into and fly in an airplane, but they also look like a Jeep painted blue. They're square, they've got little wings sticking out of them, and that's where you learn to fly blind, instrument-only flying, because, man, those airplanes are expensive if you don't do well on instrument flying.
For people that haven't seen this photograph, it's an incredible photo because when I looked at this, I literally thought, what are these? Are these like those coin-operated machines that you used to ride as a kid at the grocery store?
That's exactly what they look like, yeah.
It's incredible to see. And this is what they were training to go and risk their lives to save the world, essentially. So.
Yeah. Instrument-only flying, the worst possible kind. You know, fly by instrument when you can't see anything, like where you're going to land or what's in front of you, things like that. So when these guys finished, and we know this from these letters in the John Davis collection, when these guys finished, if they were set to return to Europe, and the vast majority of them were, they left Alabama by train, and they went up to Canada, usually to Toronto or Montreal, and then they'd board ships, go back over to England, and then they would be dispersed however their assignments were. Now, we don't know about DSS Fraser himself. We don't know where he spent World War II. We don't know anything about his post-war life. What we do know is that this particular fellow survived, and when he passed away in 2010, he was an amateur ham radio operator, and he lived in Cornwall, England.
Oh, I was going to ask, was this the only notable instant that we have of an allied nation having their military train here in the Wiregrass?
It's the only one of which I'm aware.
I was going to say I've never heard of this in my years working at the.
But you know, the successor of this is the training that goes on out at Fort Novosel. Used to be Fort Rooker. We have people from many nations at Novosel learning how to fly and maintain helicopters. They're from all over. If you go to lunch in Daleville, these guys are all over the place, chowing down. Yeah, all of them officers, men and women. So yeah, there's a continuing presence of non-U.S. nationals here in militaries being trained. I don't know if there were any before the Arnold scheme. Which is an interesting question. I'm just not prepared.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. It just came to my mind because I was like, that had to be kind of a new idea at the time, a new concept to bring in another country's military to sort of train right here in our backyard.
Sure. And it makes perfect sense given the political and other situations at the time. I do want to say something about the material that is displayed in the It Came from the Archives blog post of September 7th, 2023 that we're talking about right now. And that is the relationship between the postcards, of which we've published 2 or 3, and where those photographs came from. And to me, the most interesting thing is there is a postcard of the tarmac with these AT-6 trainers on it, and there's another postcard inside of a building with these link trainers in it, and we show those as postcards, but they are photographs that appear in a Napier Field souvenir book that the copy of it that we have comes from Cadet DSS Fraser. And so all of these guys were given this book, and the photographs in the book, some of them became postcards. And I think the way they became postcards is that somehow or another, a local photographer or drugstore got a hold of these. Maybe the local photographer made these photographs that were published by the U.S. government. But this local photographer got hold of these, contracted with the company, I want to say it's the Coswell Company, that was the biggest publisher of these colorized postcards in the U.S. There were 2 or 3 companies that did this, but this one company was enormous. And they would take your photographs, they would turn them into colorized postcards, and then send you back batches in the thousands. One of these postcards was purchased in a batch of 12,000 here locally. And so a purveyor thought that he could sell 12,000 of these postcards. And you see these things all over the place. They were published from the early 1900s until into the 1950s from this same company. And the reason I can tell you what I can tell you about these photographs is that the Internet Archive, which is a big publishing concern of open educational material, has digitized this company's order books. And you can track who bought these things, when they bought them, what the description was, because every one of these cards carries not only a title, but a code number on it. And so you can find these cards in that Internet Archive book. Now, so we don't have a copy of that book because it's not in our collecting policy, but you don't always use things that are only at your own facility. Sometimes you've got to use things at other people's facilities. That's the nature of research.
Absolutely. It's there for a reason. And for those that might be looking at the article online along with us, you can see these numbers, these code numbers on some of these postcards. I should mention also that this entire article can be found on Troy Today, and it is titled, if you're looking for it, it came from the archives, RAF pilots trained at Napier Field near Dothan. There's a lot of really cool photographs, postcards in this article, and it was up there on September 7th, 2023, which is another easy way to find it on the website. Dr. Olaf, thanks for shedding light on this subject about these individuals who I don't think a lot of people even knew they were ever here. So this is a pretty cool bit of Wiregrass history.
This is the kind of thing that we dredge up in the archives by finding a little piece here and a little piece there just when we're going through the collections. It makes all the work worthwhile.
So we've reached the end of this episode, but definitely not the end of the Wiregrass archives. There is still so much to discover and so many more stories to be told on this podcast. You can find more information on your own at troy.edu/wiregrassarchives. If you like this podcast, be sure to tell a friend, and we'd love it if you left a review in the App Store. That helps other people find this show. I'm Greg Phillips, joined as always by Marty Olaf, Director of the Wiregrass Archives in Dothan, Alabama. This episode was recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio and was produced by Austin Toy and Joey Hudson with help from Kyle Gassett. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We'll be back again soon to tell you another story, and you'll know it came from the archives.